So this week we welcome Simon Biggs from James Cook University and also the newly installed IRU chair. Simon, congratulations.
Thank you, Tim.
Now, with the Accord announcement imminent, how can the IRU have an impact on shaping the future of the sector, especially when there's so many other voices to compete with?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's about competition, Tim. I think my take on the IRU, like all these bodies that represent different parts of the sector, you seek, I suppose, to bring a perspective that can help the government think through, well, how will any proposals we bring forward strengthen the sector? I think the interesting part about the IRU to me is that we're most definitely not a one-size-fits-all collection of universities. We have we have a range of universities, some regional, some capital city, some newer, some more long established, some larger, some smaller. And that, I think, things that work, if you like, with our set of universities as a collective, potentially are going to work for the whole country, because we're very definitely not a single kind of single entity type organization.
At the same time, does that make it harder to get a voice with government, given you've got the Run Group, which has its natural constituency of just regional universities speaking for them, the Group of 8, very much we're the Sandstones. Where do you sit in between that, and how can you strengthen the IRU's voice?
Yeah, I'm not sure it lessens our ability to have a voice with the government. In some senses, I think it allows us perhaps to, if we can find a position of agreement between our universities, then potentially we can. That should provide a picture perhaps that can help the government in seeing, well, if such a diverse array of universities can find a way to come together around this issue, then there's probably something to be explored a little bit more. It's absolutely, it's not just about suiting a regional university or a small regional university like mine at JCU. This is, if we can see how it can work for us, but likewise La Trobe, for example, in Melbourne, can see how the same issue can work for them, then you're bringing together those different voices in a way that perhaps gives us some credibility when we take things forward.
Do you think that Australian universities have been famously challenged by coming to a common agreement when you take the whole 42 or so of them together? Do you think these smaller groupings of interest aligned universities, the smaller lobby groups, if you like, are the future of giving a better voice to the sector?
No, I don't know if they're the future. I think it is about, it's very difficult to find areas that work for everybody when you've got a diverse sector. In part, that's the joy of having a diverse sector, that you've got diverse providers, but it will mean that any given individual sort of policy or approach of the government might not work as well for some as it does for others. So I think, but a diverse UA has a particular purpose, for example, GO8 has a particular purpose, Run has a particular purpose. I think having those different voices hopefully ultimately will make for better policy.
2024 promises to interesting times, for want of a better word. If you're going to rate, the most important issues, you've got the Accord response, AI, industrial reforms, research productivity, enrollment growth. What's the most important 3 issues that you would see coming out this year?
Look, I think for the sector, top of the list will be the Accord. I mean, the Accord is, I think, going to make 40-something recommendations to the government. The government obviously may or may not choose to accept those recommendations. Whichever ones it chooses to accept, I think, the sector is going to be looking hard at how that will impact the sector, and also looking at the ones it might it might reject. You know, why will you reject those? In the end, and you know, the one issue that matters, of course, to any organization is what's the basis on which we're going to be funded, because that drives the resource we have. You know, any strategy in the end requires a resource base behind it that will allow you to actually deliver that strategy. So I think that by definition means the Accord will be probably the highest priority issue for the sector this year. I think AI, you know, I am interested you raised AI. I think AI, not just for the higher education sector, but for pretty much everybody, is something we're all going to be really having to seek to understand. How do we ensure we get great value from what AI can provide to us without it compromising the quality of what we do, or the essence of who we are and what we do. But you know, the genie's out of the bottle, as it is with, you know, these things come along and you might choose to fight them, but you know, it's no different to the, you know, I think of my own background. You know, pocket calculators didn't exist when I started at school. They came in when I was at school. We learned to use them and adapt to them. And you got Microsoft Excel and you learned to use spreadsheets. You know, you could argue all of that is we need to go backwards and people should be able to, you know, do sums in their heads. Well, I don't disagree necessarily, but the reality is the tools are there and we have to learn how to use those tools and take full value from them. So I think the university sector has got a lot of work to do to understand not so much how to control AI, but how to actually ensure we're using it effectively, both for our education and for the future careers our students are going to go into, where they're going to be users of this technology, but also for our own businesses, right? There's a lot of gain I think we're going to be able to get as organizations. There are a lot of tasks that we do inside universities that are repetitive. You know, processing of student records, all of these sorts of things. How can we use AI to streamline that workflow and release time to do things that are more interesting and more productive and lead to a richer student experience, for example? So
absolutely. It's the range of options of things to spend time on this year seem to be growing and growing as month by month goes by. Now, tell us about, speaking of time, how do you divide your time when you take on a role like this? What proportion of your month would be taken up with IRU time versus JCU time?
Yeah, I don't know, but you know, I think typically you know, it waxes and wanes across the year, I suppose. You know, when the Accord documentation is published, I'm sure that, you know, there'll be work to be done by the IRU team, supported by me as the chair, along with the other vice-chancellors. And then, you know, we might have a quiet period for a month or two, and then something else will come along that will need our attention. I think typically it's hard to quantify, I think, exactly how much time you put in. You put in what you need to put in, I suppose. In the end, as vice-chancellor of one of Australia's universities, I can't afford that the extra roles deflect me from my main job. After all, this is the one that pays the bills. And you know, the JCU will always have my primary attention, but I think you just absorb the extra work, don't you, into your life, and hopefully it's not too onerous. But ask me in a year's time and I'll tell you how onerous it is.
Absolutely. Now, about JCU then, how's JCU going? How are you traveling? And have you got some key directions for this year?
Yeah, look, overall, you know, JCU has a particular purpose that is part of the attraction of JCU. You know, it was established to be Australia's university for the tropics. That's not a focus that we've ever lost as an organization. It was one of the attractions for me to come here, that it's one of of the universities in Australia, it was one of the ones that has the most differentiated strategy in a sense, but largely that's by virtue of our place, by virtue of where we are. And so that's actually a really attractive part of working at JCU, that we have a very well-defined purpose for existence. Look, our challenge, like all regional universities, is the relatively thin population base that we have to satisfy, and the large areas over which we operate. So, we primarily service two reasonably sized cities up here in the north and far north, in Townsville and Cairns, but their collective populations are 500,000 people, which, when you compare that to the major capital cities, that's not a significant population. And the challenges, therefore, of running an organization that has to have its operations distributed across multiple centers with relatively small populations. That is why most independent reports show that for us to run a university up here is proportionately quite a bit more expensive than running a single campus operation in the center of a capital city. That's not a criticism of being a single campus operation in the center of a capital city. It's just a fact of life. So I think, that leads us back to the Accord, and many of us have been making an argument that for the funding model to work well in Australia, it does have to take account of these quite widely differing environments in which you're trying to run a university. And that means that, we do have, certainly for us, we have to be very thoughtful about how we get our job done. And I can assure you that that's part of the fun, but it's also part of the challenge. But the good news is, JCU, I think, has a real reason for existence. We do have a population here that is significant and, does deserve access to higher education.
And so I guess the question then is, well, where to from here with growth for you? If growth is necessary to sustainability, do you look online? Do you look to a capital city? You can't grow and people magically in the regions, can you?
No. Look, the growth agenda is interesting, right? I don't think growth is required for sustainability, but what is required is a picture of what size do you need your university to be to achieve the outcomes you're seeking to achieve. Look, we're never going to be, some universities in Australia, aggregate student load is over 80,000 students. That's not a feasible outcome for us up here in North Queensland, far North Queensland. So we have to cut our cloth differently. I think we do have to have a picture of, well, what is a reasonable load, and how do we get there? But once we get there, then it is about how you manage yourself carefully. With growth in the long term, you can't keep growing forever, I think. So what's the right size for us? And we're developing a picture of that. And then that defines, if you like, the envelope of our operation. And inside that, we have to decide, what are we going to focus on to be an effective university in our context?
Last question then. Did you read or experience anything over the break that gave you pause for thought, and you thought, well, that's something we could use next year?
I'm currently reading a very thick book by Simon Sebag Montefiore called on the history of the world. Actually, it's a 1,200 page long, but it's focused on the families who it's focused on world history through the concept of families. I think what you always learn when you read these sorts of things is there's not much new under the sun, right? Stuff goes in, stuff goes in cycles, and some of the periodicity of some of those cycles is long, and in some cases they're quite short. I think I reflect on that in terms of the JCU as a university. Very interestingly, looking back through its history, we've been, like all organizations, in times of feast and times of famine over the 60 years we've existed. And I think, it's difficult. You'd like to think it'll always be feast, right? But history tells you that that's not always the case. So I think for us, it's about how do we respond in the here and now. There's always a view that, pace of change is so intense now. I don't know. My whole career has never been stood still. Societies continued to change. Technologies continued to change. Change is inevitable. I think it's more. I think what we have to do is embrace the fact that change is inevitable, and not lock ourselves in too hard that it will always be like this, And so for me, it is, how do you create? I think it's how do we create the necessary agility in our sector without compromising the academic qualities that have brought us to where we are.
Fantastic. Well, that's a very thoughtful response, Simon. Thank you. Best of luck with the IRU gig, and of course, ongoing at JCU.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it. See you again sometime. Thank you.